So it's a really great pleasure to welcome the three experts that we have on this panel speaking today. So firstly, we'll hear from Catherine Kennedy. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Bern. Catherine is the director of the South African History Archive. This is a human rights archive based in Johannesburg. She has a background in library and information studies and has been working for a long time on the book trade in South Africa, on developing accessible library services and information training in universities in the UK and in Zanzibar, and is very supportive of that work. So thank you, Catherine. It'd be great to hear from you. Secondly, we'll be hearing from Patricia Tappatá de Valdez, who joins us from Argentina. Welcome and thank you for joining us. She is currently the head of the directorate in charge of the relationship with civil society organizations at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Argentina. She's the former director of Memoria Abierta, which was an alliance of Argentinian human rights organizations who were working together to preserve and exhibit and document the history of state terrorism in Argentina. I'm sure we'll learn a lot from you. Thank you for joining us, Patricia. And then we will hear from, last but not least, but from Patrick Walsh, who joins us from Australia. Thank you and welcome. Patrick's been working on the case in Timor Leste from 1999 to 2010, and I imagine still is involved, where he was seconded by the UN to help establish and then to advise on the Timor Leste Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then he subsequently served as an advisor to the Post-Truth Commission Technical Secretariat. He's written very widely on this case and is an established expert in this area, founding a magazine Inside Indonesia, for example, and as well as playing a role of director of the Human Rights Office, the Australian Council for Overseas Aid. So I think you'll agree it's going to be a really interesting panel. It'd be great to get into a lot of detail in these particular cases. So the way it's going to work is, it's not going to be a radical structure, but we'll hear from each of the speakers for around up to 10 minutes. I'll give you each 1 minute warning, if that's okay. And then I'll pose a question to each of the speakers, and then we will open the floor for discussion and for questions. And we have until 3:45, so plenty of time to really get into the cases. So, without further ado, I will give someone else the microphone. Catherine, if you could just make sure to not go as close as I did, that was obviously a problem.
Okay, I'll give it a go. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion. I represent a fairly scrappy little NGO in Johannesburg. We've been going for a long time, but we really are independent. And so to be talking about the Truth Commission archives without having actually worked within the National Archives is a kind of unusual position, I suppose, for an NGO to be. Given that archives are all about provenance, really, I feel like I do need to wear my organizational identity on my sleeve. We are a self-declared activist archive, which we interpret to be looking at the kind of inherently political nature of the archival endeavor. The kind of archives as a response to or struggle against a replication of dominant power structures within the archive and representation of dominant wealth or distribution of wealth within the archive. So really it's about kind of archives for a just future, the idea of archives that guard against valorization, the disavowal, the emergence or settling in of new grand narratives, the neglect that comes with a lack of attention to or political will around the prioritization and the resourcing of archives. And of course, to guard against cultures of secrecy that certainly in South Africa we've inherited from the past, as Yasmin referenced briefly this morning, both in terms of the apartheid structures and in terms of the cultures within liberation struggle movements who by necessity were imbued with secrecy in their structures. and a secrecy that we're seeing more disturbingly emerge in the South African context through the use of the current government of apartheid-era legislation in order to defend or enable greater secrecy. This is not a new idea. This is in archives. This is an idea that's been written well by Bern Harris, David Wallace, Michelle Caswell, Terry Cook, but I suppose we believe it to encompass the idea that Archives for Justice often exists on the margin. It's an idea that encompasses independent, non-professional archival initiatives, often located in civil society, often set up to counter dominant stories. Now, our relationship with the Truth Commission in South Africa and the Truth Commission Archive, it was a fairly logical area of focus for us as an organization. We were established in the 80s by anti-apartheid activists who were interested not necessarily in archiving, but really in the relationship between archive and contemporary struggles for justice. And in that period of time, it was about the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. The expertise in SAHA staff and in the SAHA board includes ex-TRC commissioner, ex-TRC researchers, people who were involved with the National Archives task team investigating the mass destruction of records as part of the Truth Commission's work. So our interest in the TRC archive on some level was inevitable. We as an organization were concerned with trying to come up with ways to test the extent to which the TRC archive was going to be available and accessible for the ongoing work that was represented in the recommendations of the Truth Commission. We were also interested in trying to test the parameters of new legislation in South Africa 12 years ago, which was the introduction of the Promotion of Access to Information Act, and to see the extent to which this act was going to enable access to the Truth Commission archive in line with the final recommendations of the report. We've done this in a variety of ways. We've done it around using a formal strategy around submitting PIRE requests. We've also done fairly ordinary civil society kinds of engagements that's been about testimony, about trying to find and collect and bring into the archive the counter archives, the kinds of independent private archives that have been developing either in people's homes or through NGOs, activist groupings, to make sure that the official TRC record that had a particular purpose and intent and mandate was contextualized, supplemented, countered, argued with records that were emerging from other interested groups. And so we, over a period of 3 to 4 years, we conducted oral histories of people that were part of the Truth Commission, researched for the Truth Commission. We collected these materials, digitized these materials, made them available through a website, and obviously to any researchers who are interested in visiting our archives. But all the while submitting a host of PIRE requests to check and to attempt to hold the state to account in terms of their obligations as the custodians of the Truth Commission archive. As Yasmin mentioned this morning, we're in a slightly odd situation in South Africa, in that while the National Archives houses the majority of our Truth Commission records, the Department of Justice still controls access to our records. And so the majority of our PIRE requests, we've submitted thousands of requests broadly in our work, but in relation directly to the TRC archive, we've submitted over 70 or 80 requests, 70% of which were obviously to the Department of Justice and slightly less to the National Archives themselves. Just to give you a sense of our success rate, over half of those requests were refused. The reasons for refusals to those requests were primarily for two reasons in terms of our Access to Information Act. Section 23 and Section 27. And Section 23 is the very depressing section that talks about public bodies being able to come back to us and say, sorry, we can't give you those records because they do not exist or cannot be found. It's the most common reason for refusal we get across the board. So that speaks enormously to the quality of our internal record keeping and the state of our national archives in South Africa. The other reason, Section 27, is not even really a reason. It's when the department can't actually be bothered to get back to us. It's a deemed refusal. So you submit the request and you submit a reminder that they need to respond within 30 days, and then you give them the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, well, they haven't responded within 30 days, but in terms of the Act, they could have asked us for an additional 30 days, so let's just give them the additional 30 days. So both of those kinds of refusals embody some kind of passivity or lack of engagement or lack of interest with making materials available. Now remember, these materials are the materials that were gathered in the course of the Truth Commission, which was based on principles of openness, transparency, and public scrutiny. That's what our commission was famous for. In the actual final report produced by the Truth Commission, it explicitly says, actually I'm going to read it to you. One of the key aspects of the Commission work has been its commitment to transparency and public scrutiny. Its records are a national asset that must be both protected and made accessible. So we're not really doing very well. Obviously, we have had some successes, and we have built this growing archive of released materials around the Truth Commission that is accessible to anybody who would like to come to our archives. And that's our way of trying to help people who find it very difficult to navigate quite an alienating, disorganized National Archive service. Remember, we also have a skepticism of institutions of power, a cynicism around whether state departments are going to provide information. We have many citizens who don't feel that they necessarily understand that they have the right to ask for this information. We also have people who feel alienated by the academy or formal research processes. So it is about trying to create alternate spaces for people to be able to access these records. I'm going to just focus on one key example, because actually once I start talking about this, I'm known to not stop for a long time. So given that I've got 1 minute left, I'm going to speak really quickly about a fairly devastating and ongoing request. In 2006, we requested access to the TRC database. And now the TRC database was considered, again, quoting from the TRC report, to be a national asset, and to echo Yasmin's words from this morning, it belongs to the nation. It uses that word. It is a unique archival collection that belongs to the nation. So, 2006, we submit a PIA request. And we come back, we get a response saying, well, firstly, we don't hear anything. We eventually get a response saying, no, you can't access it. Not only did we get a response saying you can't access it, the Department of Justice sent 22,000 letters to all the people that were listed in the database, stating that SAHA had requested their personal information, including their ID numbers and their bank details. And I mean, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be laughable when you actually look at this letter. This being, despite the fact that we explicitly stated in our PIA request that we wanted an anonymized or a redacted version of the database. So we then spent months having to manage, understandably, angered survivors and victims' families contacting us going, who are you? What do you want our records for? And we had to do a lot of damage control based on misinformation. Once we'd recovered from that, in 2009, we submitted a request again. It was initially refused. We appealed it. It was initially refused. Eventually, when our new Minister of Justice came in September 2009, he overturned a whole lot of refusals around access to Truth Commission records. And one of the refusals he overturned was access to the TRC database, a database that we still don't have a copy of in 2013. I've met with government officials dozens of times. We've got letters of support from people like Patrick Ball of Benetech explaining that to the Department of Justice, we'll help you in any way to enable you to give us a workable copy of this database, because the litany of excuses that we've been offered by the Department of Justice includes, and I actually have this in writing from the Department of Justice, the only person who had the password for the database has died, and so we can't give it to you. I'm going to stop there. I think that's a good note to stop. Yes, I'm going to hand over to you. I know I'm over time.
Good luck, Patricia. You have to follow this. Last note. I'll hand over to you straight away. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Save my questions for.
Okay. Well, perhaps this panel is after the lunch and many of you are sleepy. You select to put 3 persons who speak English and 1 who try, so at least you are not bored because of the language. I am thinking that if we talk about archives, about the whole process of dealing with the past, it's quite interesting to revisit the case of Argentina. Taking in mind that we are commemorating this year 30 years of democracy, and at the same time we are right now we always said that we experience the whole menu of options that the country used to think about in terms of dealing with the past, but we are right now having a lot of trials for human rights, for serious human rights violations, in particular for crimes against humanity. And we have in my country more than 2,000, it's 2,072 people accused of being authors of serious human rights violation. An important number of trials are just finished, and we hope to finish with this process quite soon, perhaps in the 3 or 4 coming years. So we have a different archives, and it's good to see in this perspective that SwissPeace organized. As the process of dealing with the past, the process of having visible archives about this process is long. It took many years, decades, to have well-organized and available information about human rights violation, at least in our country. And archives are key elements in this process of dealing with the past, but archives can't produce miracles by themselves. Alone, archives are not capable of producing any differences in any scenario. So there is necessary the presence of some conditions to make the archives a useful tool for human rights purposes. And I just write a list. All of you can add other conditions. That's civil society actors, a very active civil society, attorneys or people from the judiciary with interest in going deep at the moment of doing their jobs. I underline this interest in going deep, because there are many people doing their jobs, but they have to add something to this. Some sensitivity or sympathy from the press and good journalists to work on the topic. Good ideas in terms of how to disseminate and reach broad audiences, capacity to make partnerships, and money, lots of money. I totally agree with Jasmine said this morning that archives are imperative in the way to know the truth. And I want to very quick describe the 5 kind of archives that we have in my country. First of all, CONADEP. The CONADEP is the National Commission to Investigate Disappeared People that was created immediately after the end of the dictatorship by President Alfonsín. And we named CONADEP both the Commission and the Archive, because this is the main archive, and it was the cornerstone for whatever happened later. It was the first official collection about human rights during the period of the terror of the states, and this archive is right now located in one of the buildings of the precinct of the former clandestine detention center of the Navy School of Mechanics, one of the more emblematic clandestine centers of detention in my country. The CONADEP Archives is composed by testimonies of the victims. It's a very simple way of organize the information, because the main information they collect is case by case from the presentation, from the application of the victims that at that time went to sit and to give their testimonies to the Commission. And photos of the disappeared people, photocopies of the identity cards of the victims, some additional information like habeas corpus or letters that the relatives have about the victims, and the reconnaissance, I don't know if I am pronouncing in a proper way, of the former clandestine center of detention that the Commission did at that moment. In the final report, the Commission lists 365 places that were used as clandestine place to keep the people kidnapped, and after further investigation raised the figures to 500 places. But these are the testimonies, the photos, and the card identities, and the reconnaissance of the former clandestine center of detention is the main document that has the CONADEP. So this is our first official files. Previous to the existence of the CONADEP, we have thousands of documents collected by the NGOs and collected also by the relatives, the organizations of the relatives of people that were killed or disappeared. At that moment, at the moment of the end of the dictatorship, dictatorship, there were not possible to have any access, any kind of documents from the armed forces. They used this information to make the report, and then the CONADEP passed this information to celebrate the trials to the military juntas in 1 year later, in 1985. These records also were used to face the policy of reparation that it was implemented during the decade of the 90s, during the 90s. Right now, there is used to register, to record the official list of victims, is always only one source, that is CONADEP, and to answer hundreds of judicial requests from our country and from abroad about the victims. The second quite big archive that we have is the archive of the military juntas, the trial to the military juntas, excuse me. It's a judicial archive. The name is Causa 13, because that was the number at that time. There is the original copy is in the Cámara Federal de Apelaciones en lo Penal, and a whole complete photocopy, well organized and totally accessible, is in the hands of Memoria Abierta, ready to be consulted by the public. And recently, just less than a month ago, Memoria Abierta opened to the public the whole digital copy of the 534 hours of video of the whole trial to the military junta. We have to wait 30 years, and Memoria Abierta made a partnership in between the Cámara de Apelaciones, the judges, with the support of the 5 judges that made this trial, the cooperation in terms of resources from the Universidad de Salamanca, and Memoria Abierta, who made the technical work and the classification. Another type of archive is the collection from the NGOs. It's a very huge collection. Part of this is available through digitized copy in the website of Memoria Abierta, and a very good initiative put together all this, not the whole information, but it's like put together the description of the archives at the occasion of presenting this for the UNESCO program Memory of the World that the Argentinian archives from NGOs and the CONADEP archive obtained in 2006 or something like this. The fourth kind of archives is the archives from the intelligence division of the police. We have 3 of these archives that belongs to the police from the provinces. We are a federal country, and the 3 of them are open with some requirements, but it's open to the consultation of the public. And the last and more contemporary initiative, we have right now in an ongoing work 3 search unities working in 3 ministries: the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Security, who take care of the whole police corps in my country, and at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The purposes of these 3 search units is to identify documents and pass through to the judiciary to for the judicial processes. There are very, very interesting findings in these teams. There is no public access to these documents. And another thing that is quite new is that in the documentation center, that is very small, of the memory park that has a monument to the victims, is the whole list of disappeared and killing people in a database that is accessible to the public also. This is very new, just 2 months ago. The whole list was always published by internet, but it's not possible to go through as a database. This is new. And who are the users? This is very, very important questions. In Argentina, the use of this archive is for judicial purposes, for academic research, lots of academic research. Sadly, is more people coming from abroad than from the country. Sometimes in the past it was a question only about interest. Right now it's a question of resources and fellowship and so on. And the third purpose is for the generation of, to raise awareness about the need to protect human rights. And for that reason, there are many NGOs and a lot of filmmakers doing films and tools for education or tools just for dissemination. My last point is our challenge is to solve or to think about how would be the way that we will use to give public access to the tapes from the current judicial processes regarding crimes against humanity, with the cooperation of the judiciary and the National Institute for Cinema. Every other trial is being recorded, but we have not right now a strategy how to open to the public. Of course, the written documents, once the trial finish, are available, but this enormous amount of films is a big, big question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll hand over now to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for including East Timor on the agenda. Some people may debate that Australians can speak English. Some may debate that Australians can speak English, but I'll do my very best. Patricia. I've done a short paper, and I'm very happy to provide a copy to anybody who's interested by email. I've also added a few slides to help, given it's the sleepy part of the afternoon. The East Timor Truth Commission, whose acronym is CAVR, Portuguese acronym, it's the first in the region, and it's also distinctive in that it dealt with human rights violations committed principally by a foreign country, Indonesia. This not only led to massive destruction of the very short supply of hard copy information that East Timor has. It's a poor place that largely depends on oral traditions, not written traditions, a lot of illiteracy over many centuries. So there was a lot of destruction of the records that did exist, including held by the Catholic Church. And more importantly, in terms of this discussion, the CAVR Commission had no access to records of security agencies held by the Indonesian military. So we had no access to police files, prisoner files, etc., etc. I won't talk to the slides, I'll just let them float past. Basically, the UN supervised an act of self-determination, a referendum, in 1999. And in 2001, the Truth Commission CAVR was set up, and it was basically given two key things to do: to debrief, to take statements from people, victims who'd survived, and we took many thousands of statements, and secondly, to facilitate community reconciliation between perpetrators of less serious crimes, who happen to be East Timorese, and their victims, who are also Timorese. So in terms of our truth-seeking, we focused on gathering the facts from all quarters, including, as best we could, Indonesia. But in terms of our community reconciliation process, we only dealt with East Timorese perpetrators. So this wasn't a reconciliation commission per se between East Timor and Indonesia, if you get my point. So the heart of the archive that we now have stored, and that was referred to in the previous presentation, consists of the statements given by victims and the statements given by East Timorese perpetrators. It's hard to underestimate the importance of this record to the new nation of East Timor. It provides an objective hard copy of recent history and reduces Timor-Leste's traditional dependence on oral retention, oral interpretation and transmission of information. And we all know what happens to Chinese whispers and to information that's passed from person to person orally. It memorialises the sacrifices of many Timorese and is a means of their recognition and healing. It's a rich resource of educational material and lessons learned that can be passed on to future generations through the teaching of history, civic education, human rights, non-violence, rule of law, and the terrible harm that happens to ordinary people if impunity is tolerated. It's also a record of evidence that is critical to the search for accountability, justice, peace and reconciliation. And lastly, it complements the narrative held in Timor-Leste's resistance archive and constitutes an important reality check for all those involved in the sorry East Timor saga, whether Timorese or Indonesians or members of the international community. This was an item on the agenda of the UN from 1960. This was an international issue from when East Timor was declared a colony of Portugal, people with a right to self-determination as far back as 1960. So there were many players involved, including many members of the international community. But having said how important the archive is, I want to stress that it's only a start. It contains the accounts of only a small percentage of both East Timorese survivors and East Timorese perpetrators, and is almost completely devoid of accounts from the Indonesian side. It also contains only a small percentage of relevant documentation on the period held by institutions, governments and individuals outside Timor-Leste, and none of the external holders of material has been officially approached by Timor-Leste to make their material available as recommended by the CAVR. It should also be noted, this is a sad bit, that following some very good work after the dissolution of the Truth Commission in 2005, the development of this important archive, I would argue, is currently stagnating, is currently at a standstill. Maximisation of its potential and its contribution to nation building will depend, I believe, on the establishment of a follow-up institution that's currently in draft legislation before the Parliament, but even though it's in the pipeline and it's now 8 years on since the report was delivered, we still haven't achieved a enactment of that legislation. Let me just ask and respond to 3 questions. How have the CAVR archives been preserved? The answer is in the picture there. A room in the former colonial prison contains the hard copy paper records gathered by CAVR. We were required by legislation and in our individual contracts to surrender all the material we collected to the CAVR for future generations. As you can see, the material's filed, cabinet shelves, etc., and it comprises the statements given by thousands of victims, perpetrators, political leaders, the records of over 200 public hearings, research materials, submissions, administrative files, and so on. So it's very comprehensive. It will also contain the records collected by the Second Truth Commission in East Timor, the Commission for Truth and Friendship, which was jointly conducted with Indonesia. We have audio-visual archives stored in a separate room for climate control purposes. Sections of the paper archives have been digitised and preserved, copied to the British Library in London with funding, I'm happy to say, provided by a Swiss philanthropy. However, parts of the collection have not been digitised and remain extremely vulnerable, not particularly, I think, at this point to political threats, more to environmental threats, and this is a big concern to me. I should also note that the CAVR archive is not the only record of criminal and related evidence in East Timor. The UN Serious Crimes Process, which started in 2000 and which continues to this point in a modified form, also has much evidence, and that is complementary to the CAVR collection. My second question, how have the CAVR archives been used? One use we've made of them, of course, is to incorporate them in the monumental report prepared by the Commission. As you can see, it runs to 3,500 pages. It's a 5-volume report. It's very comprehensive, and we deliberately tried to include in it as much of the human face, the individual evidence that was given to us, particularly by victims. We've also rendered this in a comic book version. As I said, East Timor, largely illiterate. A lot of people depend on simple information, and there's some pictures of it in comic book version. We've also presented it in a standalone exhibition, a walk-through SAHA exhibition, so that school students, visitors, whether internationals or locals, can come and have easy, quick access to the report and hopefully be stimulated to refer to the full report and its lessons, particularly lessons for non-violence, for respect for rule of law and accountability. This slide shows a bunch of East Timorese students visiting the CAVR, which is in the old prison and itself makes a big impact on people. However, the archives have not served the interests of formal justice for serious crimes or the interests or rights of East Timorese to reparations. These records have not been used in alleged criminal cases because the Timor-Leste prosecutor has not yet acted on cases referred to it by CAVR. Secondly, the archives have also not contributed to assessing reparations for victims because the Parliament has not yet completed debate on a draft reparations framework. My last question, are the CAVR archives currently accessible? They are, but on a strictly limited basis and case by case, decided on its merits by the Executive Director of the Post-CAVR Secretariat. So for all practical purposes, the archives are off limits and very restricted. And again, I think the answer to that is for the Parliament to enact archival legislation that relevant to all archives in East Timor, including archives that are not about human rights and violence from the past, and to establish the Institute of Memory that is currently the subject of draft legislation before the Parliament but has still not been enacted. In conclusion, I would just repeat that I think East Timor's leaders recognise that the CAVR archive is a unique and irreplaceable collection from a period of fundamental and extraordinary historical change in Timor's long history, and the leadership is committed to its maintenance, including provision of funding on an annual basis. However, nearly 8 years after the formation of the archive, the Timor-Leste Parliament has not yet decided on its long-term future or enacted legislation, as I said, to guide policy and procedure on archives, including access in East Timor generally. As a consequence, I believe the management, the preservation, development and use of the archive is at a standstill and is not serving nation building or the rights and interests of victims and accountability. Now, I'm conscious that I'm actually indirectly challenging some of the sort of very nice statements made by the researchers in the session immediately after lunch. On the spectrum of best practice through to worst case scenarios, the presenters of the session after lunch, Brioni and Sandra, I think sort of suggested that CAVR was more towards the positive end of best practice. I don't think it's a worst case scenario either, it's somewhere in the middle. And that leads me to say that I think we need assistance from holders of relevant records. East Timor, as I said, was an international issue. Its memory, its history is scattered all around the world, including here in Switzerland, through the ICRC, for example, through the UN, and we need help from those quarters. We also, of course, need help from Indonesia, and I believe the goodwill that Indonesia's shown Timor since independence and the intervening years may very well roll over into support for documentation. And lastly, of course, we need technical and financial assistance. So I'd be very happy to talk to anybody who's interested in following me up on that. Thank you very much.
So a very big thank you to each of the speakers for what were very detailed and fascinating case study reflections. I'm aware of the time, so what I'd like to do is just use the opportunity as moderator to pose a question to each of the speakers and then ask them to respond, have a couple of minutes to respond, and then we'll open the floor for questions and hopefully leave enough time for all of you to contribute as well to the discussion. So obviously there's lots of questions and comments that I could make, but I'll just pick one for each speaker, and I'll start firstly with you, Catherine. Obviously it's very interesting the point that you made about the disjuncture perhaps between some of the principles of the Truth Commission itself and what we now see as the actual legacy of the archive, I suppose. And the question I would ask on that is, do you think somehow, or what do you think the role has been of this sort of dominant success narrative about the Truth Commission in South Africa? Do you think that those principles, which you say have often been lauded as like a model, and many people refer to the South African case as being successful, do you think that that has in itself affected the way in which the archives have been dealt with in the legacy and maybe affected levels of demand, for example, and reactions to your work? I'll let you ponder that, or would you like to ponder or react immediately?
I'm willing to give it a go. Yes, I mean, I think the international reception to the Truth Commission and the way it is held up or has been held up as a model example of public participation and engagement and openness and transparency has led to a certain degree of initial complacency on the part of, and self-congratulatory behavior on the part of South Africans. and on part of the government. I think another point that's really important to stress, though, and it's something that came out a lot in this morning's sessions, is the anticipation of archive. We didn't really anticipate archive within the Truth Commission. I mean, as Yasmin was talking about, she as a commissioner only started really thinking about the archives quite late in the process. And that has plagued the issues of management and ongoing accessibility. And understanding of what the archive is. I mean, our archive isn't processed properly at all. I mean, we're still working with old transfer lists as a way of actually being able to figure out what's in the archive. So there's a whole lot of things that come together. And of course, the other contributing factor is the fact that we are kind of in South Africa in a period that we're only just emerging from, where most people just don't want to talk about our recent past. There is that very common trend towards amnesia. Let's not talk about the past because we need to be moving on. I mean, that kind of memory gap, that lapse in engagement with recent history in conflict and post-conflict situations is evidenced in contexts around the world, so it's not unique to South Africa, but I think in terms of there being demand for use of the archive, I think until we actually push through this first kind of 20 or 30 years after our transition, I always find that a slightly problematic phrase. I think we're well in our transition still. I think we're not going to see interest from South Africans, but we need to make sure that the records are there so that when the interest returns and the need to examine our past returns to us as a country, we actually have something to examine. I think that's one of the key imperatives behind the work we're trying to do.
Thank you, Catherine. The idea of the passage of time actually links to the question that I wanted to ask Patricia, which was that you started your talk with the significance of commemorating 30 years of democracy in Argentina. And I wondered whether what you think about those moments, I suppose, during transition, whether they affect whether you see a change in society's attitudes towards, for example, the archives and access and use of them, and the role of the archives in building up a memory of the past as our current understandings of violence and of democracy and of transition change. Because in Argentina we have the benefit of this kind of longer term perspective. So I wonder if you could maybe say a few words about this.
I don't know if it is correct to say that archives, if we understand archives as a collection of documents, that in the case of the CONADEP collection of documents is totally restricted to the public consultation. I can say that archives do nothing. But this is not true in a certain perspective, because there were many people that using archives did a lot of things. But archives by themselves, if we said archives as people walking, knocking the door, asking for an appointment, and take the paper and look at documents, very few. But filmmakers, journalists, historians, teachers, using the archives, then they did very creative, shocking impact developments that raise aware at least about how bad was for the country the time of the dictatorship. Mm-hmm. In addition, this poor, hard information was always surrounded and used by groups with a strong symbolic power in terms of street mobilization and introducing lots of educational tools in the formal schools, in the formal curricula, excuse me, in primary school, secondary school, lots of and more growing amount of research from the universities. So looking or talking in that way, I think archives were really meaningful. If we talk archive as a place with information, keep it, I can say the majority of the people know nothing about the existence of this archive.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thinking then about the sort of the nature of the archive, what is an archive in that sense? Patrick, I was really interested in what you said about the importance of the oral tradition in East Timor, and I wonder whether it would be possible for you to say something more about how this has maybe affected or shapes the response of people to something like the archive process, which is about writing down and documenting and keeping materials in a way that we could see as perhaps being quite far from some forms of oral tradition. Do you think this has, I mean, in what ways is it culturally meaningful for people there? Do you think it's affected the way in which people can engage with the archive, the fact that they have this strong oral tradition?
Thanks very much. As I said, the archives access to the archive is very restricted at the moment, so there's really no way of measuring public interest. Mm-hmm. But taking up your point about the oral issue in Timor-Leste, I would say most victims would not be comfortable with, reading, accessing and reading documents like that. Mm. So the use of the archives is going to depend on the education system, development of historians, and of course them writing history, people writing their own accounts and so on. But in terms of the work of the CAVR, I think the oral tradition was a big plus actually, because we, as I said, we ran something like 200 public hearings, and what surprised me was we'd said for years, the civil and political rights of the East Timorese have been repressed, well, forever really, way back to the 16th century when Portugal took over through neglect as well as in other more positive repressive ways, and particularly, of course, during the Indonesian period. But when they were given the floor in a public hearing, the Timorese presented very theatrically, very graphically, and very powerfully, and they were moving experiences, and they had the impact of conveying to the Timorese public, those present and those listening on radio or reading about it in newspapers the next day, or those who had access to television. There wasn't a lot of that in 2002, 2003. It really had an impact on them, and the point we were trying to make was this is what happened. These are the terrible things that happened to ordinary people because there was no rule of law, because structures broke down, because only a few people made all the decisions, and if the military is not accountable, there's no parliamentary system, etc., etc. So the hidden, sort of the take-home message, the subtext was when a society engages in violence, ordinary people get hurt, and that was a very important lesson. That's what we want to continue, of course, through the education system and in a more systematic way. But we need access to the archives, we need better trained teachers, we need curriculum development and all those sort of things. So, there's a lot to do.
Yeah. Thank you
Thanks.
very much. I'd now like to open the floor for any questions or comments, or perhaps you might want to share from your own experiences of other case studies to help us reflect on these case studies again. So would anyone like to start us off with a comment or a question? Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question to Catherine, because I'm very surprised that there are so much reluctances by the government in South Africa to give access or to give more access. And you explained the fact, but we don't know why, because there is a why probably. It's my first question. It will help us because it's people with whom we used to work in our daily job. And as you know, people are coming in Geneva to the committee or to the Human Rights Council and everything is okay. And now you tell us that it's not so okay. Probably it will help us. And my second question is, what is the role of the South African Human Rights Commission or Committee? Because they have a role to play also. Because in my presentation this morning, I was raising the issue that National Human Rights Institution has a role to play. Did they act on this or not?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Why is our government reluctant to give us access? I really wish I knew. I've got some theories. I've heard some fairly impressive conspiracy theories around it, but I think in part it goes back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier, that we really are a country that's trapped in these inherited cultures of secrecy. We do a lot of work around access to information beyond the Truth Commission archive, which includes working directly with government departments and the deputy information officers and the clerks within the departments that are responsible for releasing documents. And the amount of phone calls we field as an NGO, as an independent human rights archive, from government departments asking us for help in how they interpret the Act, because so many of them have never received training on how to implement PAIA. So it'll be something that has just been slotted into their job description. They haven't been given extra time for it. And so you're sitting with people who don't know whether they're going to do the right thing. And as you may have been following in the media over the last few years, there is an increasing pressure to control flows of information in South Africa, which means that these people who are working in the government that have been given these responsibilities to release records, if they don't know how to discern whether it's a record that they should be releasing or not, they tend to say no, because they'd rather not be wrong and release something that they're not supposed to and get into trouble. On some level, it is as simple as that in some case. With the Department of Justice, it really is farcical that the Department of Justice, which is the government department that is responsible for the implementation of PAIA, is the government department against whom we have litigated the most in order to get documents released. And part of the reason there is that there is an incredibly obstructive deputy information officer. The same bureaucrat has refused our requests over and over again, unapologetically, with failing to comply with the obligations in terms of the legislation. And there isn't really much, there aren't very many mechanisms available to most South Africans to pursue or challenge refusals, because we don't have an information ombudsman, we don't have a regulator. The Human Rights Commission has an advisory role, but they don't have any teeth. They can't force responses out of government. They can only request departments to engage. And so too often government departments are just sitting back going, well, we don't really need to do this unless they litigate against us. And literally, every time we've litigated, we haven't ended up in court, well, with one exception, because they've settled. And there is this pattern where you just ignore access to information requests until it's likely to end up in court, at which stage the legal advisors step in and go, well, government department, you have failed to comply, so you don't actually want to go to court. You just want to hand over the records. And so we get given all these records, including the 34 boxes. That was one of the first cases we litigated around, in order to get access to those records that are now in our archives, which is really frustrating for us, because all we want is judgments, really. We want precedents around this. But if they eventually agree to give us the records, we're not really in a position where we can get precedents. They've fulfilled it, so we don't have any mechanisms to challenge it. Yeah, I can't really answer the secrecy thing any better. It's a mystery to all of us. It's a worrying trend. It's growing. Even if we just look at our stats around access to information requests, it's getting worse. It's getting worse. We're getting more refusals than we've ever had before. We're getting more deemed refusals. We're getting more non-compliance. It wasn't great to start with. So it's not a good picture. And I mean, that's evidenced to some extent in the increase in violence in South Africa when we talk about whether or not we're in the transition. Marikana last year, the killing of the miners, can really be directly related to a lot of the unfinished business of the Truth Commission because we haven't addressed structural inequalities in South Africa. And I think there's more pressure on the governments to explain why we haven't progressed further. And perhaps that's part of the reason there's greater secrecy, because they don't want to be held to account for inactivity. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a question.
It's been very striking, I'm not going to introduce myself again, it's been very striking to see both in the last session this morning and the first session this afternoon, the political and judicial dimensions of the question of access. And when listening to Patrick Walsh, in particular, I had this notion of the question of a sort of anthropology of access to the archives. And this is quite important in terms of inserting the notion of archive into different cultural realms in order to sort of reenact what one has gone through in terms of mnemonic devices or memory devices, and to try and bring it into the fold of the understanding of one's own cultural, perhaps dynamics and one's own cultural prerogatives. When I listen to you, Catherine, I really thought, I mean, I've met Vern Harris, and it's been interesting to follow up the South African History Archive story, and it's rather frustrating to hear what you're saying now. And I suppose this anthropology of access doesn't apply so much to your case because it's a hardcore political issue, unfinished business. But still, maybe from Patrick Walsh's side, this sort of theatrical dimension that you were talking about, oral traditions and history and so on. So perhaps also in terms of Argentina, you might just add one or two ideas about what the anthropology of reinserting or inserting the archive into the minds of people in order to make it an accepted device upon which to draw. Might be a few comments on that, or an idea or two from each of you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions at this stage? Yes, we'll take your question as well and then we'll answer together. Thank you.
I'm a journalist, and thus I'm particularly interested in hearing Catherine's comment about the role of the press in South Africa. Is it tame or is it tenacious?
Thank you. Any other questions? Or yeah, we'll take one more and then we'll thank you.
Yeah, Priscilla Hayner again. I don't know if this is on. I'm struck that this panel is represents cases that are, all of them, we have some years that have passed, between 10 and 30 years since Truth Commission, since major transitions, or more, in fact. And we have two of the three cases are either a case of active resistance or a case of passive resistance, essentially. Just passivity, it sounds like, in East Timor, in terms of sort of the follow-up after whatever transitional justice mechanism in general, truth commissions, as well as other initiatives have been put in place, which makes you wonder sort of, is that I mean, Argentina, I think, is a slightly separate case, although, you know, I mean, certainly sounds like some important progress has been made there, especially with releasing videos and stuff. But the other two cases, I have to wonder, is it a conscious resistance based on political reasons, or is it more based on somehow not fully appreciating the importance of what isn't happening? In other words, is it a lack of priority, especially in the East Timor case, or is it actually understanding that, in fact, if the political powers that be actually act to allow information to come out, to allow the archives to be more available, to be more organized, etc., then in fact that isn't in interests of those individuals, which sort of is slightly connected to a conversation some of us were having over lunch, which is, I think, because we have packaged this whole area in something we call archives. For most normal people, the word archives is not really a sexy, politically contentious issue. It's something they don't really want to think about. But if you call it, you know, national history records or national memory records, and people might think, oh, you know, or atrocity files, or, you know, people think, oh, you know, there's probably something interesting there. So that's why I'm wondering, is it because we call even, I mean, your description, Patricia, of the video archives that you have from the trials 30 years ago, and now so many more video records from the recent extraordinary number of trials, that's fascinating, but I don't think of that as an archives question. I think it's actually something different. It's a cousin of that. So I think we're sort of losing something, and part of what we're losing probably is public interest and maybe political interest, because we've packaged this as something that librarians will understand and people that are very politically astute will understand the importance, but many other people, that's why my question is the resistance or the passivity conscious, or is it because there's so many other things that are more important to them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the speakers each a few minutes to respond to those three questions or parts of those questions. So would you be happy to start? We'll move to Patricia.
Thanks very much. Just a couple of scattered responses to the point about anthropology of access. I'm obviously not Timorese, so this is just based on my many years of working there. I would say, the first point to make is, of course, oral tradition is not terribly reliable in scientific terms. If you're trying to establish accountability, who did what to whom and why, and whether they should be taken to a court and charged, oral tradition per se is not terribly just, I would say. There's a tendency to generalise, to exaggerate, and to guess, and also to want to make a strong impression. The Indonesian saying is asal bapa senang. You say what your superior, what you think will please your superior. You say what your superior wants to hear. So it's basically dishonest in that sense. And in Timor, my suggestion, my impression would be that Timorese will exaggerate to make the point. So they will talk genocide, they will talk huge numbers of people. They'll even say, if you say, how many people saw the SAHA film last night? They'll say, hundreds. And then you have to sort of really work at it to pin it down, and it'll actually be about 30 or 40. But they're trying to give you the impression there was a good turn-up. So, in scientific specific research terms, it's not terribly helpful. On the other hand, I would say what really excites people, what really instructs and inspires and motivates and is a great medium of instruction is the power of place. And it's, as somebody else observed, I think, in fact, you guys in your presentation after lunch, the location of the archives in the former prison really maximises the impact extraordinarily. People are not terribly interested in reading long documents, but they are really turned on by visiting the dark cells where they feel the spirits at work. They know bad things happen there, and that really, if they need to be, that really converts them to a sense of needing to be pro-human rights, pro-non-violence, pro-rule of law, etc., etc. And that extends right through to sites of atrocities right across East Timor that need to be converted into, memorialised, but converted into sites of conscience, so that there's a message coming through. It's not just a passive memorialisation, a statue, or a plaque on a corner with grass growing up around it. It's something that's actively owned and maintained and used by that community to transmit a message about human rights and culture of non-violence, etc., to the next generation. That really works, it seems to me. And we try to use that sort of anthropology, if that's the right word, particularly in our community reconciliation process. So we exorcised evil spirits, we called on good spirits, we selected places that were meaningful to the local community, a riverbed, a sacred tree, just an open area out in the bush. We didn't bring people into a public building in the capital. We went to where they were and where they felt this whole experience was most real to them and most communicative. So, yeah, I think the other thing I'd add is that visuals are terribly important, it seems to me, in an oral culture, that people really respond to video, to documentary and all that sort of stuff. So one of the challenges is to convert the archives. I've mentioned the comic book. They're drawings done by Indonesian artists and quite powerful, but much more powerful is hearing the voices and seeing the pictures. And we actually recorded all our material, and I had a slide of the audio visual archive. That sort of stuff needs to be translated into teaching materials and video form and so on. We've done some of that, but there's a lot more potential. Why the problems in East Timor? Well, that's a huge issue, and it's largely political, I suppose. I don't use that in a pejorative terms. East Timor was until South Sudan the newest country in the world. It's never been independent in its centuries of existence. It was left deliberately in a very bad way by the departing Indonesian military in 1999. They are building a state from a very low base, and the priority of the fantastic guy who was the president, is now the Prime Minister, Shenana Gusmao, is very much people today and tomorrow. So the issue of competing priorities is very real. On top of that, there's obviously resource decisions. Where do you commit limited resources? Do you help people, lift people out of poverty, or do you address issues from the past? I would say there's a false distinction being made, and we are arguing for reparations for the most seriously disadvantaged, the most vulnerable, and that would contribute to the restoration of their dignity and the alleviation of their poverty. But it should be community-wise, and it should be instructive, not just sort of one-to-one and very random and so on and so forth. So, to be honest, there's also political problems. East Timor, we argued in CAVR report that those responsible for the violence should make the means available for reparations. Of course, Indonesia, but we also argued that multilateral corporations who supplied massive amounts of military equipment and planes to Indonesia during the 25 years of occupation in violation of Security Council and UN norms, that those companies and those governments, including Australia, should be the first to make reparations. That there is no way the current leadership in East Timor is going to say to Australia, the biggest donor in East Timor, or to Indonesia for that matter, you are guilty, you should make up for it by paying reparations. It's simply not going to happen in the real world of realpolitik. So who does it? You know, good question. And so on and so forth. So and the same goes to justice. Most of the perpetrators, as I said, and this is agreed to by Indonesia itself, live in Indonesia. They're Indonesian officers or they're Indonesian generals. There's no way East Timor that didn't win the fight on the ground in East Timor, a la Germany at the end of the Second World War or Japan, there's no way East Timor, 1 million people, can impose its will on the fourth largest country in the world, 250 million people, an ascendant superpower in the region. So, and America and Australia are very dependent on the goodwill of Indonesia in the fight against terror, blah, blah, blah. So lots stacked against justice in East Timor, and the East Timorese didn't come down in the last shower. They know which side of the bread to butter, and they are not going to create problems in that area. The short answer I would give is, I believe that Indonesia itself will deal with these issues in the fullness of time. Indonesia is now a democracy, much more open society, and young Indonesians are going to deal with this as they become better educated and they realise that what happened in East Timor also happened all over Indonesia, because it was the same perpetrators, the same military, the same regime and same policies, and they will want to address it. But that's a long-term educational process and something I'm very committed to, and it's unfair to ask East Timor to lead that, particularly in the absence of strong representations from the international community, who really should be leading it, but for various political reasons are not going to. So I look to Indonesians and the new generation. I have every confidence that down the track they will seek some measure of justice for victims, whether East Timorese or Indonesians.
Thank you very much. Patricia, would you like to take a couple of minutes to respond to these questions?
Just a comment from the last intervention in terms of trying to reflect about the process in Argentina. There is not the ideal world for us. We have a lot of complaints about how late we obtain a certain level of access. We have not a legal frame that organizes the access to sensitive files or archives. All the information from the CONADEP is restricted, but there are many other progress. And in the same line of thinking of Priscilla, I want to comment that access to the archives never was a priority from the end of the dictatorship. We were looking at that time for the archives from the police and the army, not for the archives of the CONADEP, because the archive of the Truth Commission was the information that the victims gave at that time. We always know this kind of information. We were looking for the information from the state. That was the difficult. And in the case of the people who were really investigating, that is the case of the Argentinian team of forensic anthropologists, they were nice enough to convince the woman in charge of the CONADEP archive to look at the files and to obtain the information, not in a public or formal way. They always look for the information they needed to go forward in the research. But the fact was that we really need at that time to move forward in terms of truth and justice. And during the long decade of impunity, it was because of that we only use archives, the NGOs archives, for vetting purposes. It's just because the parliament is going to approve each year the promotion of the officials or the people from the Foreign Affairs Ministry, that the NGOs go to the archives and try to obtain information about that people. And the big and meaningful effort was made at the year 2000 by the community of NGO, and the purpose at that time was, well, we have not possibilities to make justice. We are working more and more in trying to memorialize, and there are a lot of conflict, a lot of debate about the location and the kind of museum. So we decided as a group of NGOs, the human rights community, to put beside the debate about the location and the kind of museums that we want, that this is a more political debate, and with other hand, we decided to create the contents for a museum, and that was the reason that we put such an effort to look for information, organize the information, and give public access, and that was the result of Memoria Abierta, lots of a big collection of oral testimonies in video, the copy of the trial to the military junta, then the effort to get the 500 video of the trial, and all these things. And in the middle of these 2 decades, there were lots of specific judicial appeals to forbidden the destruction or destroy of some specific archives in terms of hospitals, the morgue, I don't know the name, and or the cemeteries, etc. But we have a lot of gaps that we need to fulfill, and but in the middle is interesting, and thank you for the opportunity in the case of swisspeace that convoked to make this reflection. It's useful to see some very important initiatives that we have in the middle of this long way, like the census of archives. Right now, we are doing a census in the whole Latin American continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid you're suffering slightly by being last, as we're almost out of time, but maybe you could make a couple of quick comments.
Thank you. The press is tenacious. I think that's the answer. The secrecy bill is an attempt to contain that tenacity, but we can perhaps talk about that over tea. But archives, yes, possibly we do need a branding exercise or something to get people more interested. That said, in the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen an increased interest in archives, both within South Africa and the establishment of kind of cross-disciplinary work around archives, and internationally. I mean, the fact that we're sitting here talking about archives as they relate to dealing with the past is in and of itself a demonstration that there is an increased awareness and interest in the archive. Yes, there's an incredible lack of political will. We don't have political champions saying that actually we do need to be looking at archival issues in South Africa. In part, that's because historically archives have been neglected in South Africa. In part, it's because, as there is from our ruling party an increased interest in archives, it's an interest in archives that's very much about the concretization of new grand narratives, as we've seen in the last few weeks with the launch of the grand new fancy ANC archives. Why people don't want to grapple with some of these issues? There are arguments that some people are implicated in what is contained in our archives. Arguably, there's lack of activity around things like reparations, and actually I shouldn't even start on reparations because that's one of my bugbears right now, that if the closer we look at reparations, the more we'll see the kinds of deals that were made with big business around the Truth Commission and how big business was let off. Another issue that I think we need to be considering when we're looking at why these issues aren't on the radar and aren't getting attention in terms of political will is the fact that the victims and the survivor groupings are still powerless. The dispensation may have changed, but they still don't have adequate voice. So they're just being neglected by a new powerful. And I think that's at the core of a lot of the lack of attention around around the unfinished business of the Truth Commission. We haven't done very much to address that level of powerlessness in those people in South Africa that need it the most. That's a horrible statement. Sorry. These are complicated issues. It's quite difficult to respond to them quickly.
Well, no, when I was talking about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So I hope you, like me, found the panel interesting enough to be prepared to have sacrificed your first few minutes of coffee. But we're back here again at 4:15 for the third expert panel. So I'd just like to thank you very, very much to our three expert speakers. I'm sure the conversations will continue for the rest of the day and onwards. So once again, thank you.